In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about some important points that you should use when you're considering a position and trying to figure out the best move. The basic steps that I want you to think about are shown in the first slide. As you see in this slide, the basic action items are inspect the position, that means itemize its features, and try to speak briefly about each side's goals, speaking to yourself, of course, when you're at the board. The next step is to infer. Infer means, based on the inspection factors that you found, infer a short list of candidate moves. This follows the advice of many world champions who played seamlessly, effortlessly, and intuitively. The third step is to check conclusions when you check the consequences of your shortlisted candidate moves. And of course, the last step is to decide and execute the move that you believe to be the best. Let me say at this point that it's often the case that several moves are of approximately equal worth, and in practical chess, it's more useful to decide relatively quickly if that's the case. Going back to the game, let's start with the first couple of moves. We're going to see on the board appearing a very familiar Sicilian Najdorf. And as befits his nationality, Luke McShane plays bishop e3, which is the start of the English attack. Luke McShane is British. Chuvchalov plays e5. Let's go back one move and consider that he could have played e6. Can you state briefly, as an exercise, why certain players would prefer e5 and others would prefer e6? Bypassing that question for now, Chuvchalov played e5, which clearly gains a stronger foothold in the center at the sake of a potential weakness later of the d5 square. Knight b3 is played, bishop e6, these are all standard moves. Queen d2, bishop e7, f3, castles, castles. Knight bd7, both people are developing efficiently. King b1, white tucks his king away. b5, bishop d3. Knight b6, queen f2. Knight c4, because the knight was attacked. And now let me pose you this question. In the game, white took. Would you consider other moves here to preserve the two bishops? Or do you think giving up the bishop at this stage is the right move? Bypassing that question for now, McShane took. Chuvchalov took with the b pawn, which seems logical. It opens up the b file for activity against white's king. White, though, can exploit a pin on the d file at this particular moment, exploiting the fact that the rook on d1 is opposing the queen on d8. He's threatening knight takes e6, but if you look at it, taking back with the pawn may strengthen black's position in the center. Black continued with queen c7. As an exercise for you, can you identify other queen moves at this point? And if you can identify other queen moves, such as queen to c8 or queen to a5, can you state, roughly speaking, which you think is the best? Chuvchalov played his queen to c7, and McShane went ahead and executed the threat of eliminating the bishop pair. And after f takes e, he continued with queen g3, getting the queen closer to the king and avoiding tricks where black potentially might jump out with his knight. Queen g3, Chuvchalov logically places the rook opposite the king, and McShane now hits the e-pawn, which is a little tender, with the queen. Couple of questions now for you, based on your inspection. First of all, who do you think has better chances at this particular moment? Don't use your computer engine. It's better to work it out for yourself. We'll use computers later as need be. For now, who do you think is better? Next question. Let's say black's going to guard his e-pawn. Would you rather do it with the queen or the king? The king being king to f7, and the queen being queen to, for example, c8. In the game, he played his king out to f7, so you're going to have to answer the question, do you think that was a good move? And if so, is black okay here? McShane immediately tried to open up lines to black's king, but black has a significant amount of pieces clustered around his king, so he should be okay. He happened to play queen to a5, which obviously threatens queen takes knight, and there are also sometimes ideas of rook takes b2 check, and after the king takes, then the queen can come to b4, picking up the knight in certain lines. McShane played his bishop back to c1, defending the knight laterally with the queen, but Chuvchalov took this moment to take on f4. And at this point, McShane just tucked his king away, and Chuvchalov played g5. Let's ask again, who do you think stands better based on factors that you identify in this position? For example, do you think white has a potential attack, and if so, how? Does black have a potential attack, and if so, how? If black doesn't have an attack, do you think he has good chances of beating off white's incipient attack? One way to attack, as you probably know, is to make pawn levers to open up the position. One pawn lever white clearly has is g3, so you have to evaluate defensive schemes against the scheme g3. He went ahead and played the pawn lever, and then Chuvchalov played g4. Do you think that's a good move? Going back 1/2 move. Can you identify other moves? Well, the move f3 comes to mind, and there might even be others. So try to see if you think that his given move g4 is any good. McShane ran up with the queen for lack of a better square, and now we reach another important position. Around here, we have to think for black, do we want to safeguard our king, or do we want to organize against white's king? Do we want the queens on, or do we want the queens off? These are all pivotal questions. The pawn structure is dynamic, so it's a very sharp struggle. He went ahead and played f3, preserving the extra pawn, and it's a protected passed pawn. McShane logically breaks up the pawns, and here we reach another important point. White's done all he can to open against black's king, but black seems to have active pieces, with the exception of the rather strange-looking black king. He played rook to g8. I'm going to ask you the same question. Do you think that's the right way to play, or was there another move available? McShane opens up lines. Chuvchalov activates his rook. McShane drops the queen back to hit the f3 pawn, and also, potentially, to bother black by a queen foray to a7, which would hit this rook on b8 and pin the bishop. The queen is very strong because it has long-range ambitions in both directions, and McShane is using the queen to good advantage in this position. That doesn't mean he stands better. In fact, you have to look at it and determine whether, in fact, he has the better chances at this point. Chuvchalov centralized his queen, which is something that people do when they don't have anything better to do, because usually it makes sense. But in this case, the queen on e5 may have some drawbacks. Can you identify any potential drawbacks of that queen move? McShane gobbled up the pawn, and Chuvchalov saw a free pawn on g3 and took it. The question to you, is that a good move? And if not, what are some better moves? The goal here is to build up some thinking in patterns where you detect that certain moves are dangerous and identify patterns that explain your thinking. When you can verbalize your thinking, you'll be a stronger player. Many of the patterns come from experience, not just your games, but in famous books written by strong players throughout the years. On my chess.com article that accompanies this lecture, I will list what I consider to be a core bibliography. Some of the books on the list you will probably not recognize, but nevertheless, they're classics. For example, there was a book written by Lipnitsky that Bobby Fischer regarded as classic, and for good reason. So does Karpov and other good players. And I'll explain why on the article site. Continuing with the game, Chuvchalov grabbed on g3, and after queen f2, white suddenly has several threats. Chuvchalov probably underestimated the fact that not only is h7 hanging because the knight is pinned, but in addition, the queen to a7 foray is threatened, and There must be something wrong with rook takes knight here, and I'll let you examine that as an exercise. Chuvshalov dropped his rook back in confusion, so you're going to have to ask yourself tactically, what's wrong with taking the knight off? Because clearly if white took back, it would be checkmate. He dropped the rook back to defend h7, and McShane continued with the vicious queen a7, which has all sorts of threats. The primary threat being to the rook, so when Chuvshalov defended the rook ggh8, McShane pinned the knight, renewing the threat on the pawn, and after Chuvshalov defended the pawn, McShane had time for bishop f4. Notice that everything is running like clockwork, everything with tempo, and suddenly Chuvshalov is dead lost. The reason being, the queen is suddenly short of squares in the middle of the board. If it runs out back to where it was, the d6 pawn falls, and it's ruinous because of the pin on the bishop, and everything hangs for black. He saw nothing better than rook a8, counterattacking white's queen, but after the elementary operation of queen takes rook, the game was over, because after rook takes queen, bishop takes queen, de, the pawn hangs after all, and white is just the exchange up with continued pressure against black's weak pawns. The game tottered on a few more moves, maybe time trouble, but after this last check on move 36, black had to resign because king f8 would be met by rook h8 check, winning the rook on a8. Similarly, king e8 would be met by rook h8 too, winning material. That concludes the game.